Hello, everyone. My name is Christine Melanie Benson, also known as Chrissy to my friends, and you, of course, are my friends. I am a writer, personal coach, and host of the Vegan Posse podcast, as well as a former professional matchmaker. I'm thrilled to introduce this special self-love series, a special series of episodes dedicated to expanding our tenderness, affection, curiosity, and sheer delight in one very important animal, ourselves. To give you an idea of what to expect in this special series, there are 8 episodes in total, counting this introductory episode, and we've got 7 different guests: Dr. Jen Hawk, Kylia Rohrbaugh, Delaney Fisher, Dr. Claire Mann, Dr. Doug Lyle, Derek Brose, and Dr. Will Tuttle. They'll all be talking about self-love and what it means to them. We'll be releasing these episodes daily over the course of 1 week plus 1 day. And of course, they'll remain available for viewing, listening, or downloading on Spotify, YouTube, and all your favorite podcast platforms. In case you're wondering, yes, this series is appropriate for vegans and not yet vegans. If you're a vegan, my aim is to give you some justification and even some sense of urgency for making yourself a priority in your life and loving yourself truly, fiercely, and deeply. If you're not yet a vegan, my aim is to give you those same things, as well as a sense of how going vegan might enhance and expand your own capacity for self-love. We'll be doing a little self-love practice interspersed throughout the course of this particular video to give you a taste and prelude of how much sweeter a little self-love makes your daily life. I urge you to stay open and just try things out, even if they seem silly, just to test them and see how they feel. All that said, this series is for you, not for me, so take what's helpful and leave the rest. And please let me know what resonates with you and what you find especially helpful and what you don't, so that I can continue to improve and expand this series going forward. That said, welcome to Self-Love episode 1. In this introductory episode, I'm going to be giving you the backstory on what sparked my interest in self-love and how this special series came to be. I'll also be giving you the basics on what self-love is, how to get it, and how to grow it. Finally, I'll be discussing how making a sacred commitment to love, honor, and be true to you can both launch and sustain you on a self-love journey that will last a lifetime. So first, my backstory. Like lots of women I've talked to, I've had a long history of struggling with being who I am. Growing up, I was always told that I was too sensitive. That was the mantra I heard regularly from my dad, and I considered it my fatal flaw, the reason I was never going to make it in this world. I believed that if I was ever to get anywhere in life, I had to be different from who I really was, a sensitive, imaginative, introspective introvert. The trouble was that when I tried to change myself, it didn't really work. I could fake it for a period of time, but the effort exhausted me. Over the course of time, I developed some somewhat passable social skills, but deep down, I was still that shy, sensitive little girl, and I hated that about myself. Meanwhile, I also had a long and tortured relationship with food. Beginning in my teens and college years, I struggled with compulsive overeating, with massive binges on junk food that grew more severe and more frequent over time. It got so bad that sometimes I would have epileptic seizures following a huge binge. It was no fun, and I hated myself for what I was doing to my body and my life. Looking back, I can see that even during that very dark time, which persisted for over a decade, there was a spark of self-love in me, a part of me that wanted better for me, that wanted me to care about myself and my body and treat myself well. Out of desperation, I entered a 12-step program for food issues, and that's where I first learned to talk about my feelings. I'm a writer and always have been, but until that point, I really didn't have a language for expressing my emotions. In fact, I felt ashamed for even having emotions, at least the bad ones like loneliness, anxiety, social awkwardness, shame, and shyness in general. I also learned that I didn't have to live in shame or hate myself no matter what I did. That 12-step program didn't solve everything by any stretch, but it certainly helped. Meanwhile, a few other things were changing with regard to how I ate. I dabbled in vegetarianism, and in the early 2000s, I became a committed vegetarian. My thought was, sure, if it were a choice between starving to death and eating an animal, I'd probably eat the animal. But given the options in the present day and age, how could I justify eating meat? It wasn't until much later, though, that I started learning about the other animals in our food system who weren't ostensibly being raised for meat, but were used to produce eggs and milk for humans to buy, and who ended up being slaughtered when their production value declined. The more I learned about how those hens and cows were treated and what they endured, the less comfortable I was continuing to consume those products. I really didn't want to go vegan, but I knew that niggling feeling at my conscience wasn't going to go away. So I finally did, albeit very reluctantly. By that time, my eating was much better. The crazy binges had pretty much stopped, and so had the seizures. I'd always been interested in health and nutrition, but I considered that an interest totally separate from going vegan. It was only after I stopped eating animal products that I started learning the rest of the nutrition story. Now, this is a self-love series, not a nutrition series, so I won't go into too much detail. But the long and short of it was that I learned, in part through my own experience and in part through more formal nutrition education, that if I was eating whole plant foods, that is, vegan foods without added sugars and oils, it was virtually impossible for me to consume more food than my body needed. And even when I did eat to the point of feeling really full or even overfull, I didn't feel sick and fat and bloated the next day, and I didn't have seizures. I started eating even better and feeling even better about me because I was taking better care of my body. My cholesterol dropped 80 points, and I felt so lucky to have discovered a way of eating that made sense to me on every level: physical, emotional, and spiritual. It almost felt like I'd stumbled onto love as a principle of physics. The most loving thing I could do for the animals and the planet and the rainforest and starving children in Africa was also the most loving thing I could do for my body. Now, part of loving myself more was creating a life that I loved. I'd always known I was born to be a writer, but I went to law school instead. I wrote lots of papers and legal briefs, but I wasn't writing fiction. That was too close to my heart, to me. It was during a 12-step retreat in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that I wrote the first line of fiction I'd written in decades. It was the start of a book, still not finished, but it got me started writing stories again. Years later, after moving to Boston, I started writing another book called Marrying Myself. It's about a woman who's engaged to be married to the love of her life, her true soulmate, who also happens to be incredibly wealthy, although that's not why she's marrying him. I won't do a spoiler, but things don't go quite according to plan. Marrying Myself is a fun read, not dark or heavy, but with a deeper message about figuring out who we are and what matters when the whole image we had of what our life was going to look like is suddenly out the window. In short, it's about self-love. And it got my wheels turning about what it might mean to make a sacred commitment to love, honor, and cherish myself, always. Now, it took a while, in fact, years, but I found a literary agent, signed a publishing deal, and the book was released in November 2022. To me, seeing this project through and doing what I needed to do to get that novel and my beloved characters out into the world was the biggest and best feat of self-love I'd ever orchestrated. Talking to people about the book and hearing their reactions got me thinking more and more about the subject of self-love. In March of 2023, I was part of a speaking event with Dr. Will Tuttle, author of the best-selling book, The World's Peace Diet. And I gave an introductory talk titled 7 Lucky Reasons to Take the Leap with You. Several women came up to me afterward and asked if I was going to write a book about self-love and marrying yourself. I told them it was something I'd been thinking about, and they strongly encouraged me to do so. That was the final piece. I realized my next writing project had been gifted to me by the universe. Coincidentally, around that same time, some people were in the news for having a personal wedding ceremony to marry themselves. A woman named Danny was featured on Fox News for holding a personal wedding. Even though the male interviewer clearly didn't think much of the idea, I could tell the concept was getting bigger. Now, around the same time, I had decided to go back to grad school for a counseling degree. I'd always been fascinated by psychology and what makes people tick, and I loved connecting with people on an authentic human level. I'd already trained in and was practicing a type of therapy called internal family systems, but I decided it was finally time to get on the path to becoming a licensed therapist. Meanwhile, I was still thinking lots about self-love. I realized I'd always thought of self-love as kind of a fluff issue, something that was very basic, kind of self-help 101. Now I was starting to realize that the self-love journey never ends and that it has many chapters. And just as we realize one level of self-love, another area pops up where we have to show ourselves again that we really do love ourselves. For real, no joke, no matter what's going on in our lives. In fact, especially if there's tough stuff going on in our lives. Since I was in grad school now, writing papers and doing research, I figured I'd take the opportunity to write my signature research paper on the subject of self-love. I wanted to see for myself if it was taken seriously in psychological circles, if it had been quantified and defined, and if so, what its components were. I felt intuitively that self-love wasn't quite the same as self-esteem, although they're certainly related. That research was well worth the effort. Not only was it the most fun, relevant paper I wrote in my grad program, but it elucidated some key aspects of self-love and further informed what I felt important to convey to people about self-love. But before I get into what self-love is, I want to talk about what it isn't. It's very important to recognize that self-love is not the same as narcissism. In fact, it's the polar opposite. Psychologically speaking, narcissistic personality disorder is characterized by a pervasive pattern of grandiosity, need for admiration, and lack of empathy. As I see it, narcissism artificially inflates our ego and self-image while constricting and shrinking our true selves, our souls. Narcissism also forces us to keep our worlds very small, since it's much easier to maintain the illusion that we're a big fish if we keep within an extremely small pond. All told, it's tough to be content as a narcissist because virtually every time you turn around, someone somewhere isn't affording you the adulation you're convinced you deserve. And boy, does it get your goat. Self-love, on the other hand, is expansive. It opens up both our world and ourselves and makes us better able to love everyone, including ourselves. It allows us to be our best selves with others. Your self-love steadies you, scaffolds you, and provides a stable foundation from which to conduct your life. When you love yourself, life is easier because there's less at stake. Your personal worth isn't on the line in every interaction with another human being. You feel less need to control others' reactions and opinions because you've already got the grand prize, the unwavering love and support of one very special person, you. One other important point to note, self-love is also conceptually different from self-esteem. Self-esteem is a personal judgment of worthiness. Self-love, by contrast, is not a judgment of worthiness and does not include evaluating oneself. So now that I've covered what self-love isn't, let's talk about what self-love is. Many of us may have some vague conceptions of what self-love means, but I wanted to get really specific and figure out if it was just a fluff concept or an identifiable psychological concept. In my research, I discovered this definition of self-love: a learnable attitude of self-kindness entailing self-contact, self-acceptance, and self-care. Based on my additional research and lived experience, I've added one additional component: self-respect or integrity. Thus, self-love is an attitude and a practice, not a feeling or a state. Now I'll go through each of these 4 components and give some examples of how we can practice each one to improve our overall self-love. First of all, self-contact. Self-contact is defined as giving attention to oneself. There are a number of ways we can do this. In her book, The Artist's Way, Julia Cameron recommends taking yourself out on what she calls an artist date once a week to do something you find fun and interesting with just you. For me, meditation is another powerful form of self-contact. After I began a daily meditation practice over a decade ago, I found, to my great surprise, that I was feeling better about myself. I just liked myself better. I realized it was because in meditating every day, sitting there with just me and focusing on my breath, my body, noticing my thoughts, I was showing myself that I matter, that I was important enough for me to spend this devoted time with. I realized too that even though we talk about loving ourselves, it's hard to love someone you don't spend quality time with. And by devoting this time every morning to be with just me and get in touch with me, giving myself that undivided attention, I was spending quality time with me. And it was truly transformative. In my experience, continued mindfulness throughout the day is also a very useful form of self-contact. In these tiny moments when we feel uncomfortable or excited or scared, if we just give ourselves a mental or even physical pat on the leg and say, "Yes, I'm here, I see you," then we feel like we're being tended to. Again, that we matter. So let's practice now, just taking a quiet moment to greet ourselves and say hello. You can close your eyes or don't, but just take a minute to sink into yourself and inhabit your body and feel what it is to be you. This is it, right here, right now. This moment is your life, and it's enough. The next component, self-acceptance. This component is defined as being at peace with oneself. It doesn't mean that you can't try new things or grow, but it means that you view yourself honestly, quirks and all, and recognize that you are how you are. And instead of trying to fit your square peg into a round hole, you start seeking out circumstances that suit you. In my training in Buddhism and meditation, one of my biggest takeaways was that, sure, self-improvement and striving are fine and they have their place, but at the end of the day, the amount you're actually going to be able to change is so minuscule that really self-acceptance is the biggest key to happiness. Again, it doesn't mean being content with unethical behavior or self-defeating patterns, but it's about finding effective ways of navigating life given who you are and your personality and temperament. For instance, if you're naturally shy and introverted, it means not trying to turn yourself into someone who's successful in a commission-based sales job that requires cold calls and a level of interpersonal contact that requires nonstop interaction with strangers. But instead, finding a profession with a level of interpersonal contact that's stimulating enough to be satisfying, but not so much so that it's overwhelming and wears you out. For me, a huge part of this process was letting go of my idea of what normal is. Honestly, if normal even exists, it's irrelevant because all that matters is what's normal for me and for you. For instance, if I sometimes need time alone to regroup or quiet time just to breathe, I do it instead of forcing myself to socialize or hang out because that's what everyone else seems to want to do. One of my favorite quotes, which I came across years ago in a daily calendar and don't even recall who said it, goes like this: "There are no precedents. You are the first you that ever was." So instead of trying to be someone else or changing your personality or temperament, it's much more helpful and effective to get really good at being who you are. Again, let's practice. Take a moment right now to get quiet and think of something about yourself, some quality or trait that you're not crazy about, that you don't like or even hate or have tried to change, and just say to it, "I see you. In this moment, you're part of me, and you are welcome." How did that feel? Again, it's good to test things out. They can seem hokey, but nothing wrong with hokey. Nothing wrong with cheesy as long as it's vegan cheesy, right? So the next component is self-care. Self-care is defined as being protective of and caring for oneself. This component is something that we vegans have a leg up on because the majority of people simply don't know how much their health and well-being can be skyrocketed with a whole food, plant-based diet. Have you ever heard people talk about someone who got sick or cancer or died and say she did everything right and she still got heart disease or cancer or fill in the blank? Of course, even vegans get sick and die, and I'm not going to claim that we can control everything that might happen to our body. In fact, we've lost some very prominent figures in our vegan community in just these past few years, like Sherry Kolb, and very recently, Dr. John McDougall. So the end will come. There's no getting around that, at least at this point in time. But the reality is that often when people say she took such good care of herself or he did everything right, I generally translate that in my head to she tried to do everything right, or he did everything he thought was right, like eating a low-carb diet or eating salmon every night or eating grass-fed beef, drinking diet soda and red wine, and having coconut oil instead of seed oils. The reality is a lot of people try, but if they don't have accurate information about health and nutrition and how our bodies work, their efforts won't yield results. And it's extremely disheartening for people in those situations who are still overweight despite really trying to control their portion sizes or carb intake. And it also gives the people around them license to say, what's the point of trying? Because at the end of the day, you never know what sickness is going to strike. We vegans are lucky because we at least have a solid nutritional baseline to govern our food choices. If we make our foundation a whole food, plant-based diet without added oils or sugars or processed foods, that alone puts us miles ahead of people who are trying to eat a so-called balanced diet, get lots of protein, and avoid carbs. Of course, self-care isn't about diet alone. It's also about sleep, fun, activity, and paying attention to your needs and preferences. Sometimes self-care gets confused with self-indulgence. I think of the difference by thinking how I'd care for a child. For instance, I wouldn't necessarily consider it good care to let a child stay up late watching TV and eating potato chips and not getting enough sleep and skipping school, even if the child screams and yells that those are the things he really wants to do. Similarly, when it comes to myself, there's a balance between what I want and appeals to me in the moment and what will make me feel good over the long term. I personally am big on self-care habits so that we don't have to reinvent the self-care wheel every day. For instance, for me, I know that I'm going to meditate in the morning and go out for a run. I know that those things are going to serve me better and make me happier in the long term than sleeping in, even though that's what I almost always want to do. Self-care is also about getting to bed early enough the night before that I know I won't need that extra sleep time. So again, let's practice. Take a moment to think of something you need. Can you make an appointment to give it to yourself? If not, file it away for later attention. And right here, right now, just go ahead and say something sweet to yourself. It may feel cheesy, but again, there's nothing wrong with cheesy so long as it's vegan cheesy. So to summarize those three components, we've got self-contact, self-acceptance, and self-care. To me, those components are interconnected. Just like with any relationship or in loving another person, contact is the first step. You need to reach out, establish that connection. Next comes acceptance. There's an initial contact, but we need to make sure that contact isn't rebuffed. There's a question of whether we welcome that overture, take it in. Self-contact is like the knock on the door. And then self-acceptance is opening the door and saying, welcome, come inside, you're home. Finally, self-care is the ongoing attention and care we give ourselves. We don't want to just tolerate this person being inside our home, to have an attitude of, yes, you're here, I'm not going to kick you out, but I'm also not going to pay any attention to you. Instead, it's an attitude of, you're here, you're welcome, and I'm going to care for you as best I can every single day. Of course, this connection between these self-love components isn't linear or chronological. It is ongoing. Contact has to keep happening because just like with a friend, if we lose contact with ourselves, we lose the closeness and connection, and we can't effectively care for ourselves, or at least do it well. So going on to one additional self-love component, which I call integrity or self-respect. In my graduate research, I came across some very interesting evidence regarding one additional quality beyond self-acceptance, self-attention, and self-care. It was self-respect. Through a series of experimental studies, researchers found that adherence to morals significantly influence self-respect. On the other hand, things like competency and being good at something or being praised or approved of by other people did not influence self-respect. Thus, overall, adherence to morals has a big impact on self-respect. This conceptualization of self-respect as deriving from adherence to personal moral values makes it similar in nature to the other self-love components of self-contact, self-acceptance, and self-care. The key thing to remember about self-respect is that it's about adherence to your morals and values, not necessarily the ones of society or church or your parents. People who go vegan for ethical reasons or who learn about the ethical aspects of veganism after going vegan for other reasons know every time they sit down to eat, they're adhering to their moral values. Every meal is an affirmation of their dignity and self-respect. For those of you who have not yet gone vegan, I would simply encourage you to explore some of the tougher realities about the animals in our food system by watching even just a short video like Meet Your Meat or Dairy is Scary, simply to gauge how your eating habits line up with your own value system. If they do, fantastic. Keep doing what you're doing. If they don't, consider what you might want to do to change that. The bottom line is that self-respect is a key part of feeling good about yourself as a person and living in self-love. No one can tell you what your values are or should be, including me. But the important thing to consider is whether you are living in accordance with your own values in all areas of your life, including how you eat. My working hypothesis is that vegans have an edge on self-respect because they are proactively making food choices in keeping with their moral values. So now you know what self-love entails. Are you up to the task? Are you ready to commit to you? If you're not quite sure, I'd like to lay out 7 lucky reasons to take that leap of love with you by making a sacred commitment to love yourself always and marry yourself. I'd especially like to address all the beautiful and amazing women out there. So let's talk about the world we live in for a second. Does this mythical prediction sound familiar? There's a certain special day when your real life will begin. On that magical day, which will mark the highlight of your life up until that point in time, and likely for all time, a man, ideally a tall, handsome, charming, generous, and let's be honest, incredibly wealthy man, will declare his love, pledge his eternal commitment, and thereby validate your very existence. Yes, on that day, that lucky woman, you, will at long last become someone, or more accurately, someone else's someone. And until that special once-in-a-lifetime day when you are chosen, well, up until that time, your lot in life essentially consists of a great deal of hope and anticipation, marked by extended periods of languishing, loneliness, longing, and of course, a healthy dose of unsatisfied lust. But it will all be worth it when a man, your husband-to-be, proves you worthy. Fingers crossed. Now, clearly, there are a few flaws in this fairy tale. Most notably, why should you wait around to be chosen by someone else? Why not commit to love, honor, and cherish yourself right now? And for those diehard romantics out there, of whom I am embarrassingly one, no, marrying yourself does not mean opting for a life of solitude, celibacy, or singlehood in lieu of a lifetime partnership with a mate. It simply means pledging first and foremost to be faithful and true to you. Not quite sure if you're ready? Here are 7 lucky reasons to take the leap of love with you. Number 1, heal abandonment issues. Got abandonment issues? Join the club. Who of us hasn't been hurt, rejected, cast aside, discarded at some point in their life? Now, history is history and trauma is no joke. But when we take a closer look at the abandonment that's happening now in real time, we generally find that the number 1 culprit is us. How often do you shame yourself, blame yourself, berate yourself, utterly forsake yourself in the face of failure, disappointment, or trouble? I myself used to do it just about all the time. I assumed that if something bad happened, it was because there was something deeply wrong with me. And instead of encouraging and supporting myself during those difficult times, emotionally speaking, I would leave myself in the dust. But no longer. Years ago, I made a vow to be my own staunchest ally and steadfast friend. I'm happy to report that these days my life no longer revolves around a fear of abandonment because I know that at the end of the day, no matter what life may bring, I will always have me. I urge you to give yourself that same gift. Number 2, harness the power of ritual in your way. There's no escaping the spiritual power of ritual. A personally crafted ceremony is a potent way of tapping into your subconscious drives and formalizing your commitment to love and honor yourself. Key to this process is doing it in a way that feels good and meaningful to you. You may want to ask a friend or family member to officiate your personal commitment ceremony, and you may wish to invite people close to you to witness it, both of which can be lovely ways of including people you care about in the experience. On the other hand, having a priest, guru, shaman, counselor, or other professional officiate your personal wedding can lend the ceremony a welcome air of officialdom. Bear in mind, too, that you're not required to have anyone else officiate your personal commitment ceremony. If you're an introvert or very private person, you may prefer to take your personal vows before the sky, the sun, the ocean, the earth, or the trees, in the presence of no one but you. The bottom line is that the choices are yours. This ceremony is for you. You can make it as public or private, solemn or lighthearted, elegant or low-key as you like. It will be all the more meaningful for bearing your own personal touch. I myself took my own vow to be true to myself in a private ceremony with a friend in Saratoga Springs, New York, on New Year's Eve in 2014. I've never looked back, except when I need a jolt of self-love. Number 3, create a memory that will sustain you in times to come. Naturally, your personal wedding ceremony will be meaningful to you in the moment, but perhaps even more significant will be the memory you take away of this experience, the power of which you'll be able to revisit and tap into at any time, particularly in moments of self-doubt or hardship or angst. To quote priest Father Mahoney in Marrying Myself, know that in the days and years ahead, in times of joy and in times of sorrow, you will always have this moment, the moment that you promise to love yourself always. And know that this moment will live beyond today, forever providing you a place of refuge, a place of solace, a place of peace. In other words, whatever the future holds, you'll never again have to wonder whether you're worthy of your own love. That decision has already been made. On your wedding day, you pledge your unwavering love to yourself, and for the rest of your life, you will be able to call to mind and heart that moment when you vowed to love yourself always. Number 4, no one can love you like you, so don't miss out. Think about it. You are the only person on the planet who lives and breathes in your body and is with you every moment of every day. No one else can experience you in the way that you yourself can, meaning that there's no one else who can love you in the way that you yourself can. If you can't or won't love yourself, you're missing out on a unique variety of love that no other person can furnish. And the best part of all, it's entirely within your control and available to you right now. If that's not worth celebrating, what is? Number 5, go on to be the best partner you can be to you. Of course, it's one thing to make a commitment. It's another to create a happy marriage. Making a formal commitment to yourself will motivate you to be and become the best life partner you can possibly be to yourself. You'll be spurred to go on to create the best life possible for you, a life that does justice to you and that sacred commitment. And each day will present a new opportunity to find fresh and innovative ways to show your love. What better way could there be to live? Number 6, it's an excuse to throw a party and go on a honeymoon. Deep thinking aside, holding a personal wedding is a great excuse to throw a party and even go on a honeymoon. Been searching for something to celebrate? You found it. Reason number 7, it's time for a self-love revolution. Isn't it about time that we move beyond that outdated, antiquated notion that women's real lives begin only when a man or other significant other deems them worthy? Just as self-loathing and shame have never done anyone any good, neither have self-pity and self-victimization. What better way to empower people, especially women, than by encouraging them to take the most important matter of all, love, into their own hands? By committing to love and honor you, you'll help launch a self-love revolution, a movement of love that isn't passive but proactive, that doesn't wait around for permission, but instead launches people into their happily ever after right now. Ready to help launch that self-love revolution? I can help, and check out my book, Marrying Myself, for a fictional example of self-love. Thank you for tuning into this special self-love series, and join us tomorrow for self-love interview number 1 with Dr. Jen Hawk. Now go forth and love yourself.